Well, good evening, everybody. May I welcome all of you this International Day of Peace, a day devoted to strengthening the ideals of peace, both within and among all nations and peoples. But surely we can't aspire to peace if we don't behave in a moral and ethical way. And this event was inspired by Pope Francis's prayer intention for September, which asks us to advance with young people towards lifestyles that are simpler and more respectful of the environment. He asks us to pray that we will all make courageous choices necessary for a simple and environmentally sustainable lifestyle, taking inspiration from our young people who are resolutely committed to this. We know that climate and peace are inextricably linked, that nuclear weapons and the climate emergency are twin threats to peace. We know that we must act, but how? Is this all beyond us as individuals, or can we make a difference? Our speakers have some of those courageous choices that Pope Francis prays that we'll make. And so let's just pause for a few seconds while I ask Hugh Foy, a member of our Pax Christi Scotland Executive Committee, to bring us together to reflect on the choices we make for peace. Hugh.
Good evening. Climate change and nuclear weapons have a symbiotic relationship. Each threat exacerbates the other. Climate catastrophe is in danger of setting the stage for conflict between nuclear armed states. A recent study suggests that even a limited regional nuclear war would cool the planet from anything between 2 and 5 degrees, depending on the scale, and would also cause mass starvation in that region over a decade. The nuclear reality, even outside periods of global war, we would be inaccurate to call this peacetime, has caused decades of uranium mining, nuclear waste dumping, and nuclear testing. Decisions and actions that have contaminated some of our planet's ecosystems to such an extent that they are beyond repair, with the added human tragedy, including entire communities being displaced. This evil symbiosis, however, means that nuclear weapons and climate catastrophe have a common solution, rooted in a commitment to a biblical vision of stewardship and a commitment individually and collectively to what serves the common good. It is to these solutions and that vision that we turn our prayer tonight. Lord God, you give the strength to the weak and uphold those who might fall. Renew our vision through the gospel, that in wisdom we may discover anew the values we must live today. Give us the courage to act selflessly and do what is right, for we know that those who trust in you can overcome all fear. And so we ask for the grace to be brave, to face the dangers and powers that confront us with a prophetic voice, that we might receive the help promised to all those who ask. Fill us with confidence so that nothing that is our duty as stewards of your creation will be seen as beyond us as we seek to build your kingdom of love, justice, and peace. Amen.
Amen, and thank you, Hugh. Could I now introduce Father Gerard McGuinness, who is General Secretary of the Scottish Bishops' Conference and heads the conference's recently created Care of Creation Office. Father McGuinness was ordained in July 1994 and has served in a number of parishes in Scotland, acted as chaplain to a number of schools, and after achieving his doctorate in theology in 2002, has held a number of posts, including Vicar Episcopal for Religious Education, lecturer in moral theology at Scotus College in Glasgow, and now, while still continuing as a parish priest in Motherwell Diocese, he will be helping Scottish dioceses and parishes to assess their carbon footprint. The role of the Care of Creation Office was, of course, inspired by Pope Francis's Laudato Si document. And so Father Jerry, can you now explain what that office is hoping to achieve? Thank you, Father Jerry.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you for this opportunity for myself to reflect on what I'm doing in this new post as heading up the Office for Care of Creation. About 20 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, I met with a man called Peter Singer. Now, some of you might have heard of Peter Singer. He's quite a famous philosopher. He's now 75 years old, and he's a philosopher who's known for many opinions, among which are animal liberation and infanticide. Now, remember when I went to see him and told my mother I was going to see him, my mother was shocked. She said, "How could you possibly talk to a man like that who believes in killing babies?" And I said, "Mum, the only way I'll ever change him is if I get to talk to him. That's what it's all about, evangelization and conversion." And it was in some ways a conversion experience, not just for Peter Singer, hopefully, but it was for me also a bit of a conversion experience. And I'll explain why. Because Peter Singer himself underwent a kind of conversion of heart and conversion of mind way back in the early 1970s. If you remember that the crisis in what was called at that time East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, which had declared independence from Pakistan and then suffered terrible poverty. And as a result of climate problems and flooding, the people were in dire straits. And at that time, Peter Singer was very much in academia, in his ivory tower. And that experience of seeing suffering humanity, Peter Singer explained to me, and he's written it in his own books, that changed how he did philosophy. He realized that for philosophy to be real, it's got to reflect and relate to the people who are suffering, to, as Pope Francis would say, the cry of the poor as well as a cry of the earth. So he moved, if you like, from academia, strict, pure academia, to an academia which was rooted much more so in reality. And one of the big themes of Peter Singer's philosophy is responsibility. How am I responsible for what's happening in the world? How am I responsible for what happened in Bangladesh and East Pakistan? Because Peter Singer firmly believed that he was responsible, even though he was in his university at that time, I think it was in Monash in Australia, he was responsible for what was going on. I think he firmly would believe in the 6 degrees of separation, that all of us are ultimately related one to another and that we are responsible for each other. But it's not only about a responsibility for each other as human beings. Peter Singer's big thing, of course, is about a responsibility for animals, and that's where the whole animal liberation theme comes in. But as I said to Peter Singer at the time, that's not really that much outside the Catholic tradition. If you look at the Catholic tradition, we also believe in a continuum between creation, all creation, whether it be plant life, animal life, human life, the planet, it's part of who we are as Christians, and very much in the Catholic theological tradition. And just to maybe prove my point, the 5th preface of Sundays, I'm going to now read to you, says, "It is truly right and just, our duty and our salvation, always and everywhere, to give you thanks, Lord, Holy Father, Almighty and eternal God, for you laid the foundations of the world and have arranged the changing of times and seasons. You formed us in your own image and set us over the whole world and all its wonder, to rule in your name over all you have made, and forever praise you in your mighty works through Christ our Lord." A preface here, which I've changed a wee bit to make it more inclusive, but it's a preface which speaks to us about creation being at the heart of our faith, and it speaks to us about our responsibility for creation, our responsibility for the world. And that preface speaks to us about God has created the world for us as a gift, as a gift. And the natural processes of the world, they're all part of that gift and part of God's plan. And God has shared his image with us. And in doing so, as the fathers of the church would say, God has shared his wisdom with us. And that's where reason comes from. And God has made us co-responsible with him for the world that he has created. And we are to praise God through what he has created. And I like to think that praising God is not just about sitting in church and shouting prayers. Praising God in creation is actually enhancing creation. That's what praise for me means. So we have our relationship with the created world, which should reflect God's purpose for us and for that created world, for all living things, for the planet world, for the animal world, but not only giving praise for it, but actually enhancing those relationships we have with the created world. And that's summed up very much in theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas. If you look at his whole teaching in natural law, which is more about human reason, is about law. It's all about, reasoning. Why are we here? We're here because God wants us to be. We're here to pass life on. We're here to educate our children. We're here to live in community. We're here to know truth. These are all truths, not just about us. Some of them are specific to us as human beings, but these are truths which are true of all of creation. Everything that is wants to be. And that's what St. Thomas Aquinas says, reflecting his Aristotelian, but also Platonian. Sometimes we forget that Plato is a big influence on Aristotle as well. Thomas Aquinas speaks to us about the connectedness of all that exists. Everything that exists does so for a purpose, and that purpose cannot be separate from the purpose of the whole of creation. I can't flourish, I can't achieve my goals on my own, but only in relation to other people and to the rest of creation. And that's summed up for me very much in a book that I read many years ago by Alistair MacIntyre, the great philosopher from Glasgow, who wrote many very famous books after Virtue, 3 more versions of Moral Inquiry, but a book that he wrote later was called Dependent Rational Animals. And I suppose in some ways, it was almost like a wee conversion moment for Alistair MacIntyre, a bit like Peter Singer. That book speaks to us about how we are dependent on one another. And part of his whole philosophy there is developed in the fact that he looks at the animal kingdom and he sees the relationships even within the animal kingdom, within dolphins, where there is an understanding of the group, of the community, and looking out for those who are in the community, those who are weak in the community, those who are ill in the community. And the whole point of Alistair MacIntyre's understanding in that book is that in order for us to be truly human, we have to be givers and receivers. We have to be givers and receivers. And I think when we reflect on the climate crisis right now, we reflect on creation and we know what we receive from creation. We receive so many fruits and goods from creation, but what do we give to creation? What have we given to creation? We know because COP26 is coming to Glasgow. We know what we've given to creation. And I think that idea of a continuity in creation between plant, animal life, human life, I think that's really at the heart of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. And that's why we formed this Office of Care of Creation as part of the Bishops' Conference of Scotland. Our aim is to put into practice the ideas, the inspiration of Laudato Si. It's not just about climate change. Climate change is part of it. And right now, my little group that I've got together, I've got some volunteers who are very enthusiastic. We're focusing on COP26 right now, and we've got plans coming out for parishes in a couple of weeks' time as we approach COP26, which incidentally is 40 days from today. It begins 40 days from today. But we're trying to put into practice the ideas of Pope Francis from Laudato Si. And there's one paragraph which I'll read to you, which I think sums up what I'm wanted to say to you tonight. In number 229 of Laudato Si, Pope Francis says, "We must regain the conviction that we need one another, that we have a shared responsibility for others in the world. and that being good and decent are worth it. We have had enough of immorality and the mockery of ethics, goodness, faith, and honesty. It is time to acknowledge that light-hearted superficiality has done us no good. When the foundations of social life are corroded, what ensues are battles over conflicting interests, new forms of violence and brutality, and obstacles to the growth of a genuine culture of care for the environment. You can see in that paragraph that Pope Francis is linking the whole idea of what goes on within our souls and what happens is reflected in the world. And of course, that also takes into account the whole issue of nuclear weapons, which you're also discussing tonight. In fact, Pope Francis, in that paragraph from Laudato Si, he quotes Pope Benedict from the opening mass when he became Pope, when he talks about so many deserts in the world of today. There's so many deserts not just outside in the world, so many deserts on the inside of the world, in the hearts of human beings and men and women, causing those deserts on the outside. So my hope for the Care of Creation Office is to put into practice what Cardinal Joseph Bernardin spoke about way back 30 years ago, a consistent ethic of life, a consistent ethic of life. All the ethical issues we're dealing with, and you're doing it tonight, looking at nuclear weapons, looking at climate, all ethical issues are related. And that's how we should be dealing with ethical issues. You can't just take one issue and say that this issue is more important than the other. They're all connected. And there has to be an understanding that we do this together, but we also deal with these ethical problems together, not in isolation from one another. It's a consistent ethic of life, or as Cardinal Bernardin also said, it's that seamless garment reflecting on the cloak of Christ himself. The seamless garment, human life, faith in life for all of us is a seamless garment which everything is connected, linked together. So that's my little contribution for you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Jerry, for that insight. And I think that we take that forward now as we turn to Quentin Rare, whom I first met at a global ethical finance conference in Edinburgh, at which the Edinburgh Finance Declaration put together a coalition of Christian and Muslim leaders to understand the shared values underlying different faith groups' approaches to finance. Quentin is, I must say now that I'm completely innumerate, so I'm more than impressed by the fact that Quentin is a fellow of the Institute of Physics, Chartered Fellow of the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, Chartered Wealth Manager and Head of Research and Ethical Investing at P1 Investment Management. He has applied his knowledge and experience in computational and analytical analysis from nuclear and aerospace engineering to areas in finance. He's also completed the Sustainable Investment Professional Certification with the John Molson Business School, becoming this program's first graduate in the Channel Islands and the second in the UK. In January 2017, Quentin joined P1 Investment Management Limited, founding their ethical and sustainable investing proposition. Today, I hope he can explain how ethical investment is much more accessible than many of us may expect. Quentin.
Thank you, Marion. I think I'm almost embarrassed by that, and I think that I'm almost frightened of myself now. But what I want to talk today is about the idea of climate-friendly investing, and one of the things that I think we've tried to do is to make it accessible, and hence perhaps make it easier than you think. Callum, I think the next slide, please. So I think the caption to this slide, and the way many captures many of our own journeys in life. It's the who me, it's the we're quietly going about our business, and we very much stop and reflect at various different stages. And certainly mine wasn't a planned journey by any means, but pieces come together and you actually find that you have a skill set that is telling you very clearly about something that you want to do and you need to do. And it's almost that completion of that circle, and it's a fascinating journey. So my background does include a doctorate from Oxford, actually in geophysical fluid dynamics. I won't bore you with the details, but it meant I was in the Department of Atmospheric Physics. So this business about climate change, global warming, has been drummed into me from an early stage and has always seemed very important to me. And that covers with the science, and then you get the investment side. And if you go to ethical, sustainable investment managers in the city, most of them don't have a specific sustainable investing qualification. They have experience, but not necessarily having gone to way to study it. And when I set up the P1 ethical investment proposition, my aim that, I wrote a couple of things down on that proverbial blank sheet of paper, recognizing it's a very privileged circumstance to be able to do that. And the first thing I wrote down was to do ethical investing as well as possible, given real world constraints. And the second thing I wrote down, which I haven't put here, was determined to make a difference, not determined to be different. Almost everyone sort of goes through a phase, I think, where they're determined to be different, but determined to try and make a difference. And that's not intended to be a cop-out. The idea is to invest in a manner that generates positive consequences. So you need investors and you need fund managers, and then you can work continuously for improvement. And if you seek a too high a degree of perfection, then you basically can't put portfolios together, and people would almost be frightened off as investors if you did. But if you put together too weak a proposition, you're scarcely doing anything different from what everybody else is doing. And therefore you're unlikely to have consequence, you're unlikely to affect change. Could I have the next slide, please? Global warming is a major issue. Now, I'm hoping the tech will oblige. Yes, it is. It's playing nicely. So around the clock face, we have the months of the year. We have low temperature at the center with increasing temperature on the outside. Everybody likes a graphic. In the middle, we've got the year. This will repeat. And basically, it shows how year by year, month by month, global warming is increasing. And obviously, the 1.5 degree line is the lower limit of the Paris Agreement. The 2 degree line, sorry, the upper limit. And you can see how the years progress from the pre-industrial times. Suddenly, we get this massive kick up in global warming. I just find it a really compelling visualization, because it sort of really helps show how the last few years things have changed. The next slide, please. This shows the same information in a more conventional form. And of that 1.5 degrees global warming we talk about in Paris that we're not supposed to go beyond, as the scientists now advise, very much focusing on the 1.5 degrees, not 2. Currently, we're at 1.2 degrees, 1.23 degrees. So basically, we're well on a very dangerous journey. We can already see consequences of global warming, which in a statistical sense can be attributed to global warming. What's happening is the extremes of events are becoming stronger, and events are happening far more frequently than you would expect. And I suppose one of the things about this chart here is people talk about the natural aspect of global warming. Well, this chart's been separated out, so you can see the blue line, which is natural warming and cooling from zero, from pre-industrial times. And you can basically see that essentially it's all human induced, which is, well, I suppose it tells you everything you need to know in a rather alarming kind of way. Next slide, please. And I think, global warming, it shouldn't really be a surprise. And there's no justification for certain organizations acting as though it is. Essentially, scientists have known about this in various ways for a very, very long time. We've got Joseph Fourier in 1824, saying the atmosphere keeps Earth warmer than in a vacuum. 1838, Claude Pouillet, carbon dioxide might trap infrared and mould the atmosphere. 1857, Eunice Foote is basically showing that carbon dioxide warms up more than air when subjected to sunlight. 1896, Arrhenius, the Swedish scientist, comes up with the first comprehensive greenhouse theory, identifying carbon dioxide as a key greenhouse gas. In 1938, Guy Stewart Callender is basically writing, by fuel combustion, man has added about 150,000 million tons of carbon dioxide to the air during the past half century. The author estimates that approximately 3/4 of this has remained in the atmosphere. So, and then in 1965, you've got a presidential, Lyndon B. Johnson, a presidential message to Congress about how human activities from fossil fuels are affecting the climate. You know, this I find astonishing because it shows that the harms were known and yet action was not taken to mitigate them, which is tragic. So I don't really need to expand on the words of my sort of first major bullet point there. And current practice for many fund managers in the sustainable space is to address climate as a risk management problem. And by that, what they're aiming to do is they are aiming to protect the people who invest their money with them from the financial consequences of global warming. They're not seeking to set out to invest in such a way that would prevent or slow down global warming. And this is what I mean about being a friend to climate. You know, ask this in 3 different ways. Do you manage your exposure in investment terms to the climate because A, you want to protect the climate, slow down or prevent global warming, protect Earth's ecosystems, protect biodiversity, protect human health? Or B, you want to protect the value of you or your clients' portfolios from loss of wealth because of any of the above? Or C, because regulation requires that you think about it? Tragically, too many people are thinking in terms of B and C. They're not sitting there and saying, actually, I have an a priori belief that I'd like to manage my money in such and such a way which will try and slow down this terrible thing or stop it from happening. So it's a very simple question, you know, are you investing in such a way as to be a friend to the climate, i.e. try and stop or slow down global warming, or are you investing in a way that is intended to be a friend to yourself, i.e. protect your own wealth from harm if climate change happens? So that's what I mean by the moral intent side of things. The next slide, please. So a key message that comes from all the science is basically about stopping carbon dioxide getting into the atmosphere. Basically, when carbon dioxide from fossil fuels gets into the atmosphere, it stays there on geological timescales. A short geological timescale is about 10,000 years. It's essentially permanent from a human perspective. Okay, it's not, obviously, it's not just carbon dioxide, but carbon dioxide is the major culprit. Okay, and a lot of people talk about engagement with the fossil fuel extraction companies, but given what I said before, I mean, 2 things. People have been trying to engage for a while, and the measures that have been taken thus far don't seem to be entirely effective, shall we say. And given the history that I've outlined, you know, people really have no excuse for not knowing, or the executives of these companies have little excuse for not knowing since 1965, because that's when the US president told Congress about it. So that seems a pretty good date, if you want to stick a date on it, for which people should have known. And the response hasn't really been to act to mitigate the harms that have been caused. So you've got to ask whether people are being honest counterparties in this regard. And I think that's the challenge. And one approach, of course, is fossil divestment. And I think the big approach of fossil divestment is to say there's carbon deposits beneath ground that have been safely there for tens to hundreds of millions of years, not damaging the climate. So it's best to keep them there. So, and I think increasingly I've seen fossil divestment not just as a financial markets measure. It's basically about severing ties with fossil fuel companies. And this is really important because you get certain actions by some of these companies where they're trying to blur the boundaries. And very often they're trying to blur the boundaries to perpetuate their own business franchise rather than genuinely solve the problem. Sometimes they do some small things to try and solve the problem. Divest invest, which you may have heard of, I mean, that's a positive step in the right direction, because what you're doing is you're transferring money from harmful sectors of the economy and making a point of investing it in things like renewable energy to try and promote a solution. And so that's quite a positive step. You know, financial markets are just a tool. They are not inherently good or bad. They are just a tool, no different from a hammer. They are capable of motivating powerful collective action for good or for ill. And ultimately, the objective has got to be to try and prevent or reduce global warming. So next slide, please. And this, I believe, is my last slide beyond Q&A and the disclaimer that I'm obliged by our compliance department to be encouraged to show. So the way we've tried to approach this in P1, for climate-friendly investing, to have this a priori intent to actually worry about doing something that would invest in a way to help the climate, is firstly to say you do full fossil divestment, coal, oil, and gas. Okay, they're all fossil fuels. We need to move away from them as fast as we can. That obviously includes things like tar sands, which is basically oily sand, which you then use more energy to get the oil off, and fracking to get gas out, which is more damaging. A big problem that's coming out at the moment is hydrogen. And that's probably a topic in its own right. Green hydrogen, where we imagine that electrolysis from renewable energy is used to split hydrogen out of water, is a tiny, tiny minority. Between 96% and 99%, so far as sources I've been able to see, actually comes where hydrogen is manufactured from fossil fuels. So whilst hydrogen, when it burns, is really clean, if you emit a whole lot of carbon dioxide making the stuff, it's not. You can see the problem. So we would absolutely say that certain types of hydrogen manufactured from fossil fuels ought to be prohibited under a fossil fuel divestment policy. And in fact, we're working with our fund managers that we use at the moment to make sure they understand that. So that's the first step. Keep the carbon underground, if you like, through full fossil divestment. The second step is actively invest into renewable energy, and we have policies to make sure that our investors are in that direction. And we're a wee bit fussy about what counts as renewable energy. We like it to be the really clean stuff. I could obviously expand on that as well. And then the third thing that we've done is basically we created, I found myself in a role acting, if you like, as honest broker between climate scientists, that's my background obviously, and the better of our ethical sustainable fund managers, to come up with an investor target that most closely met what climate scientists wanted and what the fund managers could deliver. And at P1, we don't charge for this service. Some people, when you join these various things, you have to pay for it. We basically use it as an engagement tool. We encourage our fund managers to use it if we can. Basically, it's this thing called NZC10, and then we rolled out a slightly stronger strength version, NZC20. And it's aiming very much to promote investment towards carbon neutrality by 2030, not carbon neutrality by 2050, because we happen to believe that if you're a climate-friendly investor, you should be showing some leadership. And it's about encouraging portfolio managers to encourage firms to develop realistic, credible type strategies to become net zero by 2030. And it's aimed at specific funds. So it's not just a sort of nebulous thing that an entire fund management firm signs up to. An individual fund has to sign up to it. And at the moment, I'm delighted to say we've got 10 fund houses with over 8 billion of funds that have actually signed up to this thing. And basically, as I say, trying to work with them to basically use their investment influence with the companies that they hold shares in to become carbon neutral by 2030. That's really all I've got to say, I think. I can expand on various points, if you like. What we've done at P1 is we run various model portfolios. We use a lot of internet technology to try and keep the cost and access of those portfolios down and the accessibility up. We also, in January, based on our model portfolios, launched a fund, the TMP1 Sustainable World Fund, which is accessible in various places, but that's a separate conversation. People can easily follow up indirectly if they want to. And 100% fossil divested, with a fixed allocation, a minimum requirement of allocation towards renewable energy under the criteria I talked about, and also criteria about encouraging the fund managers to absolutely take up this challenge to try and persuade the people they invest in to become carbon neutral by 2030. So I'll shut up now and happy to field any questions towards the end. But the aim is, as I say, to have this intent to actually structure your investments to do climate good from the outset. Thank you.
Thank you, Quentin. And I'm sure that that helps us to see that those courageous choices that Pope Francis talks about are indeed feasible. Could I remind everybody that you should put some questions into the chat box. Don't wait until the end because you'll forget what Quentin's been saying. So get those questions into the chat box as we're going, and as our next two speakers also are speaking, don't forget to put your questions there. And we're now going to turn to Alice Coy. Alice studied law, specializing in international, European and human rights law. She started her career working as a policy office at the Dutch government, then decided she would like to influence policies more from the outside, after which she worked for several NGOs in Latin America and in Belgium. In particular, she's worked in the field of youth and hopes more young people will get involved in nuclear disarmament work and that the topic can be included in their energetic campaigns on climate change. Alice has coordinated Pax Christi International's advocacy work at international levels, EU, Council of Europe, UN, since 2016. And she steers its working group on the nuclear weapons ban treaty, which is where I met Alice, including a new pre-COP26 campaign on the interplay between nuclear weapons and climate change. Alice, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Many greetings from Brussels. It's a pleasure to join you for this, this debate. Many thanks to the previous speakers for the interesting presentations. As said by Marianne, I'm coordinating the activities of Pax Christi International's working group on the nuclear weapons ban treaty. So the working group is composed by national Pax Christi members, such as Marianne and also Susie from Pax Netherlands, as well as our UN representatives active in Vienna, New York, and Geneva. Over the years, we have undertaken a variety of joint advocacy actions to promote the treaty, such as to the writing of letters to governments for them to support the treaty, but also bishops' conferences, asking them to check their investments, as we have a representative from the Scottish Bishops' Conference today with us. And we've also been organizing events at the UN in New York, having interviews with international Catholic media, and attending meetings with Vatican officials. One activity I'm particularly proud of took place beginning of this year, when through joint efforts by Pax Christi members and representatives around the globe, we managed to mobilize more than 100 Catholic leaders in support of a statement welcoming the entry into force of the ban treaty. It included support from several Scottish bishops, thanks to Pax Christi Scotland's effort, so many thanks. As Pax Christi International, our niche in the peace movement working on nuclear disarmament is very much being the Catholic voice and having contacts with Catholic leaders. Tonight, I'm really delighted to tell you about our newest activity, a campaign to make people aware about the interlinkage between nuclear weapons and climate in run up to COP26 in Glasgow. For us, this is also very much a new theme, nuclear disarmament, climate, and how it's linked. So it's very exciting, and we're also learning a lot by undertaking this activity. For the campaign, we're developing videos and accompanying one-pagers regarding 5 themes: conflict, responsibility, resources, vulnerability, and cooperation. Conflict, because climate change, as we know, generates conflicts, and in situation of conflicts, there's also more risk of nuclear weapons being used. Responsibility, because, for example, the major states, including the UK, there are having the nuclear weapons and modernizing them, but they also have more responsibility than other states in the whole climate issue. Resources, because these states are spending billions on nuclear weapons, which can impact climate, but also resources. It's also about this about the investments that the previous speaker just referred to, and Catholic institutions there. What are they doing with our money? Vulnerability, because climate and nuclear weapons, the consequence of nuclear weapons affect vulnerable population more. And cooperation, because obviously we need cooperation in this field. And the Paris Agreement and the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty show that the majority of UN states is ready to cooperate. So our campaign materials are being developed as I speak, and we hope to have everything ready, hopefully beginning of October, mid-October, the latest. But tonight I'm already able to give you a sneak preview of part of one of the videos to get you excited about our campaign. So you can hopefully share our materials with your network in due time.
Of course, we're worried about gradual global warming, which could produce conflict and even nuclear war. But nuclear war could start in many other ways, including from unstable leaders, by accident, by hacking, by bad sensors, and this could produce instant climate change. War between the US and Russia could produce so much smoke that it would block out the sun, making it so cold and dark at the Earth's surface that we would have a nuclear winter, temperatures below freezing, even in the summer. And this would kill the crops and produce global famine. Even a war between new nuclear states like India and Pakistan could produce climate change unprecedented in recorded human history and sentence most of the world to starvation. And it turns out that solving the problem of nuclear weapons is easier than solving the problem of global warming. All we have to do is get rid of a few thousand nuclear weapons. We don't have to completely remake the world's energy supply.
Thank you very much, and please keep an eye on our campaign.
Well, I, for one, am hugely impressed by that, and I hope that we can, when all of the videos are ready, that we can share them together on social media and wherever in our own circles. That's great. And I was just thinking, when that professor was speaking there about accidents happening and so on with nuclear weapons, anybody who has been watching the BBC's Sunday night vigil drama series will be well aware that horrendous things can happen on nuclear submarines. And of course, here in Scotland, we've got them very near to everybody that I think is with us this evening. So yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Alice. That was great. Our final speaker tonight is Susie Snyder, who coordinates Don't Bank on the Bombs research and campaigning. And she works with PAX and ICANN to build support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons across the business sector. After leaving a financially lucrative, but she says spiritually bankrupt Wall Street job, Susie has spent the better part of the last few decades working to support human rights for everyone and ending the nuclear threat. From supporting Indigenous communities directly impacted by US nuclear weapons policy to championing civil society access to multilateral government meetings on nuclear issues. And now she's back to the financial sector to get them to stay away from the bomb. Susie's always trying to find a way to disrupt the status quo and create a better future for everyone. And as with all of our speakers, we're honored that she's joining us. Susie, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marian. And thank you, everybody. This has been such a rich discussion this evening, and I'm truly grateful for the chance to be here with you and to see where we can go from here. I'll try to keep my remarks brief. And as my colleagues know, I can and do tend to talk a lot. So, but I'll make that effort to the best of my ability. I do want to just take a second. Whenever we talk about nuclear weapons, just to remind ourselves, these are the worst weapons that were ever made, right? They're designed to cause indiscriminate harm. They're a tool of murder. And we have to talk about them that way, because that's the job of a nuclear weapon. It's a big, clumsy bomb that blows up cities. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists noted a child born today has more than 50% chance of experiencing nuclear war. And when I read that, I freaked out. And I've been working on this issue for a while, as Marian just said, because I have a child, first off, and that scared me about my child's future. And because it's just too risky. It's risky business. And so I want to talk about the risky business of nuclear weapons. It's been said already tonight, earlier this year, there's a new treaty, a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that went into force. And this treaty makes everything to do with nuclear weapons illegal. And the real power of the treaty is that it creates a new norm that rejects these weapons because they are heinous, they are shameful. And they have no place in a modern society that adheres to, or at least works to try to adhere to international norms around human rights and moral and legal prohibitions. We try to protect civilians in wartime. We don't actively target them, but that's what nuclear weapons do. And the thing is, with nations banning nuclear weapons, this trillion-dollar industry, because it is a huge industry, it used to be quite safe, and it used to be seen as, oh, okay, these are huge contracts. This is great. There will always be a return. There's always a profit. But it's starting to look a lot shakier. And that's partly because the treaty bans any sort of support for nuclear weapons, including the manufacture or financial investment in nuclear weapons production, right? So financial institutions from mega banks like Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group to the Norwegian and Irish sovereign wealth funds, they've adopted policies rejecting investment in companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons. And one of the things that I do with the Don't Bank on the Bomb project is I talk to financial institutions all the time. I think it's great. I really like it. I love kind of reconnecting to that set of society. And I talk to social responsibility officers, to corporate social responsibility folks, to people who are on the sustainability side of these institutions, who want to do the right thing, who want to be a strong ally in creating a good world. But they don't always know how. They don't always have the freedom to do what they want. You know, they're big institutions. But we've managed to get financial institutions with policies that exclude nuclear weapons, a lot of them to come out to say this, to go public and to be loud. And right now, I'm estimating it's about $23 trillion in assets that cannot be exposed to companies that make nuclear weapons. Now, $23 trillion sounds like a ginormous amount because I can't think of that number. It's not real to me. It's fake numbers, but it's real news. And it's these are institutions like the Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group who said, no, indiscriminate weapons are not okay. And there are institutions like KBC Group, which is in Belgium, who said, you know what, there's this treaty. Belgium's not on board the treaty yet, but we better get on board the treaty because we know what happens when weapons get banned. They come after the companies and we're going to lose money. So let's get ahead of the game. And that's what we're starting to see now with the entry into force this year all over the world. People are reaching out to me. How do I get a good policy? What do I need to do? What are the companies involved in making nuclear bombs? There's an American expression. You can tell I'm American by my big mouth and my quick talking. And there's an American expression, put your money where your mouth is. And that's, to stand firm with your morals, with your philosophy of life, no matter what the impact is on your bank account. But what we found, and not just my research, so what ABP, which is a major asset management firm, found after it announced it would divest from the companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons, it did a snapshot. What did this mean for our bottom line? And it was neutral. It didn't have an impact. They didn't lose any money. They ended financing relationships with Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Airbus. We talk to them every year. These are the companies that are involved. If you go to the Don't Bank on the Bomb website, you can find the list. These are the companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons. In fact, next month, well, it's coming very quickly. I'm launching a new report that updates all the information. Who has the latest contracts for what? And here's the thing. People used to tell me when I first started doing this, they used to say, oh, but these contracts are so big. Northrop Grumman got a $13 billion contract to make new nuclear bombs for the Americans last year. Nobody's going to cut that contract. Nobody's going to end that because of, your financial institution pressures. But it happens. Y'all probably been following the news and you've seen the scuffle about the Australian, US, UK deal over submarines. I mean, maybe it's just in my news feed, but it's all over my news feed. It's not just about diplomacy. It's not just about telling the French government in advance, oh, by the way, we're going to do this little new partnership. It's about Naval Group. It's about a French submarine manufacturer that's out billions in contracts. It's about the French government, who is a majority shareholder, losing money. That contract got cut in a second. Look at the UK's atomic weapons establishment. It was supposed to be run through a non-revocable 25-year contract with Serco, Lockheed Martin, and Jacobs Engineering. But the UK decided, nope, not what it wants, cut the contract. All of these companies recognize these contracts are not written in stone. They can be lost, and they will be lost as we continue to build the pressure. This is a very real financial risk. It's not necessarily a stranded asset risk that you deal with a lot when it comes to climate change issues. but it is a financial risk. And if you're investing in a company whose backlog, whose profit depends on government contracts, and then that government is suddenly saying, oh, wait, nuclear weapons are too shameful. We can't make new ones. We're getting pressure. Oh, we have an obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to disarm, not rearm. Those contracts get cut. I've seen just this past week, new contracts being issued and old trusted companies being left out in the cold. It happens. It's a real financial risk. Then there's also big institutions that, like Spanish banks that have clients all over Latin America. Latin America is almost fully on board this ban treaty. Let me tell you, they've signed, they've ratified, they've issued accompanying notes to their instruments of ratification saying that they will not finance any company involved in the production of nuclear weapons. And these Spanish banks are saying they're also at risk. Because if they've got clients in Mexico, for example, and many of them do, then those Mexican clients are going to face, like they're going to be in trouble if they have investments in Northrop Grumman that's building nuclear weapons. It's a problem. And it's something that as we talk to more institutions in countries that are not yet ready to join the ban treaty, is starting to make them look twice and go, oh, this is not a safe bet. Nuclear weapons are not a safe bet. They're not a safe investment. There's a risk, a regulatory risk, with new requirements on disclosures around human rights exposure, around sustainability investment. There's much higher risk for these investments. And there's also reputation. I've seen public demonstrations, social media campaigns, boycotts, sit-ins, die-ins, tagging of the front doors, posters put up, advertisements put on highways about banks financing nuclear weapon companies. And that looks bad for a bank that needs to have clients to survive. If your client doesn't want to come to you because they saw something on the billboard on the way into town, that's going to be an issue. So there's this reputational piece as well. And I admit that I am part of creating that reputational risk, and I work very hard to do so by publishing the financial institutions involved in the companies that are connected to the production of nuclear weapons. And we're also bringing things directly to these nuclear weapon producers. And this is working with some of the amazing ethical investors that exist throughout, actually it's throughout the broader global Catholic network. I have to say, it's mostly Catholic investors that bring ethical ethical shareholder resolutions to the fore. It's the Sisters of St. Joseph who bring it to the boardroom of Lockheed Martin that by continuing to produce nuclear weapons, they're violating human rights. They're violating the ban treaty. And I think that's a really important piece as well. And I really want to celebrate that and celebrate those efforts. I mean, this past spring, a third of Lockheed Martin shareholders voted in favor of a resolution talking about the ban treaty, and it's only expected to grow. The same thing happened with Northrop Grumman. And these are efforts to engage, because sometimes when it comes to weapon systems, we need engagement as well. We need to talk to the companies that are building these, because they can close this income stream. They can do what ACOM did and sell off everything it had to do with nuclear weapons to a smaller institution that doesn't have any public financing, doesn't have any possibility for investment. And so they can then open their doors as a big global infrastructure company. Come on, invest in me. I have nothing to do with the bad stuff. They have that option. They can go that way. And we're working to try to illuminate that path. A lot of the ethical investors are really strong allies in this work. And I won't name them all because I'll always forget someone and I'll be really embarrassed, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to accidentally hurt anybody's feelings, because this is, you hear me talking about don't bank on the bomb, but this is a huge effort by so many, many, many people. It's people who are involving cities, who are involving pension funds at the national level, at the local municipal level, the city level, the town level. It's people who are getting their elected officials to say, hey, my pension can't come from inhumane weapons, from illegal weapons. And it's a lot of people who are truly inspired by their faith. The Fratelli Tutti, which was mentioned earlier, talked about, it says a buildup of arms and ammunition in a global context dominated by uncertainty, disillusionment, fear of the future is controlled by narrow economic interests. The arms industry has a vested interest in continuing conflict and perpetuating discord. Earlier this year, I launched a report called Complicit, and we went into how the companies behind nuclear weapons spend money on lobbyists and think tanks to perpetuate nuclear weapons forever. But we have the power to stop it. We have the power to put our money where our mouth is, whether it be because we ourselves are investors, whether it be because our diocese has investments, our religious order, the organization we work with, the place that I look to for my pension. What are they doing around this issue? What are their policies? Do they have them? Do they not? I'd like to check. I can ask them. It's as simple as asking. And it's a conversation we all know enough to have. That's the thing, like you don't need to be, we have some experts, you don't need to be an expert to ask the question, is there a policy around weapons? Is there a policy for the climate? Then start the conversation. We all have connections to investors. We all have connections in some way, shape, or form to build up the stigma against nuclear weapons, to demand that these companies stop, and if they don't, to divest. And I hope that we have the grace to be brave, to start that conversation wherever we can, with whomever will listen, and to take it from there. And I'm really happy to provide people with resources and information anytime. Just be brave, have grace, have conversations. Thanks.
Gosh, yeah. Thank you, Susie. I hope that you and Quentin can get together. I would remind everybody that as Pax Christi Scotland, we are very much trying to work with Don't Bank on the Bomb here in Scotland. And I see we have with us tonight Linda Pearson, who has done so much work for that alliance. And remember that it's our banks and our pensions that could possibly be funding nuclear weapons and other weapons as well. So Susie, thank you very much for that comprehensive explanation of what we all should be trying to do and what is actually possible. I'm now going to hand over to Callum, who is going to be in charge of all these questions that I see rapidly going up in the chat. So Callum, can I just hand over to you and let's see where we go with this.
Thanks, Marion. I'll start by bringing our speakers tonight on screen, and just bringing you all on as an opportunity to answer these questions together. And I notice, Father Jerry and Quentin, that you've already beat me to some of these questions in the chat area by answering them already. But
well, I tried to give a sort of outline answer, but they're often discussion points. So I'd certainly be very happy to talk through it if Linda would like to sort of expand a little bit on the specific concerns and issues that she's got.
No, definitely, and I will come to that one in just a moment, Quentin. But Father Jerry, perhaps if I could come to you first of all, because this question around the crossover between the Care for Creation Office and Eco Congregation Scotland was one that came up in another event I was involved in with the Archdiocese of St Andrews in Edinburgh a few days ago. And I wonder therefore if you might talk to where there might be areas of crossover, but perhaps also where there might be opportunities for you to work together.
Sure. Obviously, there are areas where we can work together, and to my shame, I have to say to you, I don't know too much about eco-congregations yet. I'm only in this role since really July, and just trying to find my feet since July. But what I have read about eco-congregations, what I have seen in the emails I get from them into my email box, it's very much about parishes looking at climate control, looking at conservation of the environment. It's an environmental charity, whereas our Care of Creation office, its inspiration is from Laudato Si, and Laudato Si is much more than just care of the environment or conservation of the environment. It takes in all the strands of life and ethics and faith, including nuclear weapons, including investment, including talking to bankers. This is all part of the Laudato Si vision, if you like. And I think if we remember, Pope Francis started with the gospel, the joy of the gospel. Then he moved on to Fratelli Tutti, brothers and sisters all together, and Laudato Si. So he's moved from a kind of looking at the church initially, then looking at the church opening itself out to other men and women of goodwill, and maybe bad will as well, as the case may be, and then looking at the greater picture of the world which we all live in. So that connectedness, it's all there, I think, in Pope Francis's vision. And as I said in my little response there, to whoever said asked the question, I think one of the big problems for me as a Catholic over the past 30, 40, in fact, most of my lifetime, and having studied moral theology and taught moral theology, is people can be very polarized within the Catholic tradition, maybe not so much in the Presbyterian tradition or the Episcopalian tradition, I'm not so sure, but we can be very polarized. You know, people can talk about pro-life and be very much in favor of the death penalty, which I just don't get, because if you look at our tradition, then you know, the Catholic tradition will give you reasons why you should be more consistent in how you deal with ethical issues. So it's a bit like me going to speak to Peter Singer 20 years ago. My mother was horrified. We met like a cafe in Manhattan. He wouldn't go to a place, he was actually very visionary. He wouldn't go to a place with paper cups. Even at that time, 20 years ago, we had to go to a place with real cups, not because he was a bit snobby, because he didn't want to be cutting down trees. And you know, I had a good conversation and dialogue with him. So the whole Laudato Si goals are, I think, about reaching out to others, reminding humanity of our connectedness. And that's, for me, that's more than eco-congregations. But of course, eco-congregations has a place, and I hope to learn from all the good work that they've been doing. So I hope that answers your question.
Very useful. Thank you, Father Jerry. Quinton, perhaps we could return to that question from the chat. And while we're doing that, you know, folks, please do continue to share your questions in the chat. I know that there are friends here who've been involved in campaigning for divestment in particularly, so please do continue to share your questions in the chat. But Quinton, this particular question, and I know you've read it already, but this notion of meeting resistance from fund managers, and how can that be addressed?
Sure. I mean, I suppose my role that I do at P1 is actually selection of fund managers, and I start from the universe of fund managers that pretty much claim to be ethical or sustainable or responsible or whatever they choose to call it, and then basically I sort of put them through a process. I hesitate to describe it. I'll call it ethical due diligence, for want of a better term. And I'm trying to assess how robust their ethical investment policies are. Now, for us, an absolute must. We have an external ethical oversight committee who are not investment people, and that's the point. They don't make investment decisions, but they help inform on our ethical investment policies. And so we've got a climate scientist, we've got a professor from Leeds who works on social issues, workplace-related stress, workplace-related suicide, and we've got a professor of corporate governance. Now, corporate governance probably sounds like the most boring thing on earth until you realize it's all about things like bribery and corruption and that kind of thing, which makes it maybe sound a bit more exciting, though not necessarily in a good way. But this thing about leadership and bravery, we run model portfolios in a fund which are mixed asset, so different asset classes, and at a sort of controlled risk level, so that clients don't find that they've invested in something that was supposed to be medium risk and it turns out to be high risk or desperately low risk. And the sort of accepted wisdom, though nobody quite told us this explicitly, but I knew perfectly well because I've worked in the sector long enough, the sort of accepted wisdom is that it's not really possible to do that in inverted commas. In fact, when we started off, we weren't sure whether we could, but we were determined to have a crack at it because we felt it was that important. And what's happened is we wound up getting to a state of full fossil divestment, something like 2 years ahead of schedule. And we actually brought a number of fund managers with us. Because as an informed client, and this is working within the system, but being prepared to be at the boundary of the system, if you like tweaking the tiger's tail, I don't know quite how to describe it, but basically not being afraid to push that boundary and say, I don't care that you're telling me that you think I'm asking the wrong question and I'm being a bit silly, and I obviously don't understand all the issues as you see it. I'm quite used to people telling me this who are the established industry figures in the investment space. But I've been in the business long enough that, and if you like, it's a matter of the confidence, the courage, call it what you like, to say, actually, despite what you're telling me of the conventional wisdom, I don't believe you. And what we found is, as that sort of informed client, we were going to fund managers and we were saying, you're claiming that you won't do X, or you're not doing X, but you won't put it in writing. You won't make it a formal policy. You won't put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. However, let us just point out that apart from the fact that from next week or tomorrow, we won't be using you if you don't, but also, and that concentrates their mind ferociously, because if you like, I'm acting as an informed client on behalf of my clients. Okay. But also, I'm able to explain to them how they could do it. And the fact that they can gain a leadership advantage. There's a little bit of appealing to their self-interest here, because sometimes you can point out to them that actually if they sign on the dotted line, they make it absolutely clear they can get a marketing advantage, which is the kind of thing that they can then use internally to sell to their marketing department if they've got sort of good intentions, but they're encountering resistance within an organization. But also helping them identify what really matters against what really doesn't. So in other words, a lot of people, something like fossil divestment, a lot of people get very tangled up in very overcomplicated policies, and then they miss the point and they decide they can't do it. But if you go back to Bill McKibben's original articles on fossil divestment, he basically, without saying so many words, he says it's basically, we've got all this carbon underground in natural reserves where it's peacefully been mining its own business for 30 to 300 million years, not causing any problem to anybody. It should stay there. So actually, if you focus on that aspect of fossil divestment, suddenly you come up with a very doable policy. And that's helped me explain to various fund managers how they can actually do this. And then you can capture other elements through other ways. This is where our NZC10, our net zero carbon 30 or target came from, because we did fossil divestment and then it's what's next. So we did fossil divestment, then we did divest invest. Then we started saying, actually, what the climate scientists really want is carbon neutrality, because that's what stops global warming. And then 2050 is what the majority need to do. So if you're going to show leadership, aim for 2030. It's sort of quite simple. Now, coming back to the very
notion that it's sort of quite simple. I'm really conscious of time and I want to...
Essentially, it's simple. The practical point, you go to a pension fund, they say, oh, we can't do it. Mostly it's inertia. There's some misguided thinking, which I think, the earliest reference I found to it, Susie, Alice may know earlier sources, was I think about the 1980s, a paper written by a couple of lawyers, sort of appealing to portfolio theory a la Markowitz, but without mentioning it, because they're not really experts, they're lawyers. So lawyers aren't, I wouldn't go to a lawyer about investment decisions. I'd go to a lawyer about law. But there's this sort of accepted wisdom that fossil divestment must harm your investment performance. There's actually been some great work done by various academics in the meantime that ain't necessarily so. The Grantham Institute, which is a collaboration between Imperial College and LSE, has done.
I'm a bit conscious of time, and I want to just...
Yes, sorry. Basically, they need to find different fund managers, or find people who will help them find different fund managers if their fund managers won't deliver. It's quite easy in that sense, but that's equally quite hard sometimes.
Susie, I wonder if I can bring you in on this one as well, and maybe talk, kind of from your campaigning experience in particular, and how we can use that experience to help us in circumstances like this where we're trying to convince, be that a diocese or an organisation, to think more openly about this.
Well, I think, again, it's the art of the possible. It is possible. It's really not, it's not an impossibility. And that's the first step, is just to remind, hey, this is something we can do. The other thing is to let people know there are so many off-the-shelf products right now that are excluding controversial weapons, excluding fossil fuels. Now, they may not be perfect. And I think, but sometimes maybe perfection can be the enemy of the good. They're definitely a lot better. And you can, if they say, oh, but we're just following the MSCI World Fund, and well, okay, well, let's switch to MSCI Sustainability Index. Boom. You're not even changing institutions. You're just changing the fund within that institution. And all of a sudden you've just eliminated a whole lot of problem companies. So there's definitely a lot of ways to do it. But again, it's that it really is the mindset. It's, this is something we can do. And it's something that we're gonna have to do to really get behind, and whether it be to reduce the threats around climate change, which are catastrophic, or to reduce the risks around nuclear weapons, which are also catastrophic. And we can do something here, and that's the great thing. Linda asked this question, and Linda's one of the most brilliant campaigners, and just amazing. And her work has been phenomenal in getting people on board with this issue. And Linda is an expert and is worth, and she can speak to a lot of this herself. So I just think it's really important to remember we can, and that's the first step.
That's really useful. Thank you, Susie. Alice, if I can turn to you, we're having a few questions coming in, just wondering where and when we'll be able to see the campaign that you spoke us through really come to life. When will that happen, and where will we find it?
Yes, so that will be beginning of October, at the latest mid-October, because we're still working on the videos and the one-pagers, and you will be able to find them on our Facebook and Twitter accounts, but we will also send out a mailing to the whole membership, so you will get a notification.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And then Father Jerry, finally, coming back to you for our final questions. I'm going to take two questions together, if you don't mind. The first comes from Julie Clegg. Now, Julie will not remember me because I was the face, a small face in the back of a lecture hall when I last heard Julie speak, but it is great to see her with us tonight. She asks if you could explain the second part of your point in the chat, where you talk about the link between Laudato Si and care of creation and the, quote, bridging of divides. So if you could maybe touch on that. But also we've got a question from Rosalind, who speaks about who's asking about the work that's being done by the Scottish Catholic bishops and their approach to divestment, since there's a very clear commitment from the Irish bishops. And Rosalind was perhaps a reluctance from her own diocese. So could you perhaps talk about those two areas, Father?
Sure. The first point, maybe coming back to Pope Francis and the Gospel of Life, Fratelli Tutti, and the Gospel of Joy, Fratelli Tutti, Laudato Si. When I read those documents, and especially Laudato Si, it brought back to me, as I said, Cardinal Bernardine, which was way back in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, who at that point in America was faced with a church which was and still is rather polarized. And his whole idea was, how do you bring Catholics together from either sides of the divide? How do you bring together with a moral vision, which everyone, well, fundamentally we share the same moral vision. So why has it led to polarization? And then I think part of what he said at the time, if you look back at his writings, was, you know, we have to go back to our tradition. We have to go back to our tradition and retrieve from our tradition what we've lost. And obviously, a lot of our tradition was shaped, disfigured, misshapen by the Enlightenment and after Enlightenment. And one of those things, obviously, which really made a monster of our theology, our ethics, was the idea of the domination of man. I'll say man, that's okay, over nature, man's dominion over nature. And that's what's led, if you like, to this whole environmental problem. Also, in some ways, the whole nuclear issue as well. So you know, we within the Catholic Church have a rich tradition, and there's so much in it which binds us together. And if you look at where our positions come from, I think you can find there are common roots between people of different views even today, and to remind them, you know, what is it we believe, what is it we live in our lives. Has that been shaped by the world around us rather than shaped by our faith? Has it been contaminated? So in terms of Laudato Si, in terms of Pope Francis's vision and the care of creation office, what I would say to Julia is that you know, there has to be a new way of doing Catholic ethics. I know you taught Catholic ethics at Glasgow, and I certainly heard you a couple of times at moral theology conferences in Europe. There has to be a new way of doing it. And I know you try to do that in some of your writings. And that's what I see the Care of Creation Office doing, bringing people together rather than dividing people in terms of our ethical vision, our moral vision. Moral vision should not be about division. It should be about bringing people together. And maybe in the second question then, Rosalind, this is a funny one, Rosalind. So pre Father Jerry, pre me coming into this, Bishop Nolan put out a pastoral letter, which you'll remember, at Pentecost for COP26, which was a very good letter. If you haven't read it, all of you, you need to go to the Bishops' Conference website of Scotland and find Bishop Nolan's letter for COP26. It got a lot of praise at the time. And in it, it does say that the bishops are committing themselves to divestment. Now, the reason we didn't announce it publicly was there was a public announcement 3 days before Pentecost or 4 days before Pentecost. But Bishop Nolan wanted to hold his thunder for his letter until Pentecost. So we didn't do it publicly in terms of Operation Noah, but we did it publicly in our pastoral letter at Pentecost. But Operation Noah now have been in touch with us and have asked us if we would like to do it publicly on their platform at the end of October, because I think every 6 months there is this announcement of who's divesting. So we are actually doing it. The bishops discussed it at their meeting 2 weeks ago, and we're doing it at the end of October, and that includes the Archdiocese of St Andrews in Edinburgh. I always get that mixed up. If I say Edinburgh, St Andrews, you always get upset. St Andrews in Edinburgh. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, friends, thank you very much. I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and thank you to everyone who sent in questions. And I will hand back over to Marion.
Thank you very much. And yeah, Callum, wonderful questions and such insightful answers. And I can only thank all of you. Thank you to Father Jerry McGuinness, to Quentin Rea, to Alice Coy and Susie Snyder for their thought-provoking presentations and to their responses to all those questions that you've asked. Thanks to you, Callum, for guiding the Q&A session so skillfully, as you always do. Remember, if it was too much to take in, the recording will be on our website and YouTube channel as soon as we can get it up there. I know I'll be watching again, but for now, with thanks for his prayerful guidance, I'll ask Hugh Foy to close our evening with a prayer. Hugh.
Lord, we have gathered in your presence. We thank you for the wisdom, challenges, and graces we have received in our time together. Inspire us to remain bound together by the mutual living of your call to peace and justice as your beloved community. We pray that we will leave our gathering empowered to take action, to cease those destructive choices individually and politically that enact violence upon your people and planet. In those future moments when we might lose hope in this struggle, we pray that we are graced with the dangerous memory of Jesus, that we will surrender again and again to hope and love, that our love for you, all people, and the whole of creation will then place love at the heart of all we do in your name. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Hugh. I would say good night to all of you. Peace be with us all. Thank you for making this such a super event. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Bye.